Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for February 16th through the 22nd, 2025. So let's get right to it. Starting off with the Northeast region, I briefly wanted to touch on the event that I'm sure a lot of you have been very much inundated with over the past week, and this is the crash landing of Delta Flight 4819 in Toronto. As the investigation is still ongoing pertaining to this aviation mishap, we don't have a whole lot of details to go off of. However, we do know that the aircraft crashed while landing at the airport and everyone survived. So that's the good news. Fantastic news. It's an utter miracle that anyone walked away from this crash. However, it looks as if right now everyone survived with comparatively minimal injuries. Of course, due to the current threat environment, I guess you should say, many people immediately want to know why. Why did this happen? Why did this specific incident happen? And why do these incidents seem to be happening more often? So I will talk about that in just a moment because this is a very fascinating trend that we are starting to see. As far as this specific incident goes, it's, of course, hard to say. The official investigation is ongoing. It will take many, many months probably to get any sort of definitive assessment on this particular crash. However, I do want to mention that based on photograph and video evidence of this plane crash, most of the rhetoric that I have seen, most of the assessments that I have seen coming from pilots, commercial airline pilots on social media, on forums, on the internet at large, most of the sentiment is that the pilot in this case failed to flare the aircraft properly, which caused the aircraft to make contact with the runway harder than it should, which in turn caused the aircraft to break up essentially. So right now, the initial armchair quarterbacking speculation is that this was an exceptionally hard landing due to some sort of pilot error. Now, we don't know if any kind of weather or wind shear played into this. We don't know if there was any kind of instrument failure or any kind of hardware failure on the aircraft. We just don't know yet. All we can do is look at the video like everyone else and see that, yeah, this was a very, very hard landing that could have gone much, much worse. So that's the kind of general sentiment with this specific incident. Now, I did want to dig into this a little bit more, so please bear with me for a moment, because I think people are starting to ask a lot of questions. Not just why did this specific incident happen, but why do incidents like this seem to be happening? There is a general question out there of why do aviation mishaps continue to happen at an increased pace, right? Or at least that's what it seems like. And this is not made any better by mainstream media doing what mainstream media does best, which is extremes, right? So we're starting to see, or at least I guarantee you, if you were to go searching for news stories on any kind of aviation mishap right now, the information space is very saturated with two kinds of ideas, right? And the first idea is everything's fine, all of this is normal, you're blowing this way out of proportion, don't even look at it, don't even click on the article, don't even acknowledge that an a plane crash happened, just move along. And the other extreme, which is we're all going to die, essentially. And mainstream media organizations, like the typical ones you see, but also, in a lot of cases, in so-called independent journalists, right, especially on social media like Twitter, they will bounce back and forth between these two extremes of nothing's happening, shame on you for even focusing on a plane crash, and oh my gosh, we're all gonna die, we're lucky that an aircraft even flies anyway, right? So these are two extremes, and as many of you probably can guess, the truth is somewhere between these two extremes. When it comes to the former position, the everything's fine, don't even pay attention to this kind of thing, a lot of times you'll see mainstream media articles written sort of like this. This is from ABC Channel 8 in somewhere America, where they're writing about the statistics that anyone can obviously pull from the NTSB and from the FAA. And if you read articles like this, you get the sentiment that, okay, well, they're blowing this out of proportion. The total number of aircraft incidents and accidents this year is below the average, even, so this is all just smoke and mirrors, don't worry about it. However, as you can probably imagine, once again, a purely statistical analysis of the raw data that the NTSB and the FAA put out, it's not going to capture the full picture. It's not going to factor in things like instinct, atmospherics, and things like gut assessments, survival instincts. These things are very, very important. Now, from a data science perspective, I'm sure a lot of people scoff at this. Well, the data is the data. Data doesn't lie. No, data doesn't lie, but data can be misleading if you capture the wrong data to use to make a point, right? This is a very deep rabbit hole that we can talk about at a later time. I think that it's a worthy thing to talk about, but just for today, let's, in the interest of transparency, let's go through the NTSB, the National Transportation Safety Board's monthly aviation dashboard. And as we can see, if we factor in all of the aircraft incidents that have happened so far, there were 63 aviation accidents in January, and there were 35 in February so far as this data has been updated. It was last updated on February 20th. That's when I pulled these screenshots. And you can very clearly see that this is below the number of accidents that have occurred for a long period of time, right? For many years. But just for transparency's sake, you can go to these dashboards and you can look at all of this data and you can form your own conclusions. But in doing so, I would encourage you to think about, how can this data lie to me? Is it possible for this data to not entirely be the best way of looking at this? So when it comes to our own risk management perspective, we're in this kind of weird nebulous space where everyone's gut instinct is, why are these aircraft incidents and crashes happening more often or being more severe when they are happening? And then we look at the data because we're trying to be objective. We're trying to, do the right thing and see, is this happening more often? No, it's not happening more often. It's happening less often. But when it does happen, it sure does seem like it's becoming a little bit more serious. So I say all of that to bring in risk mitigation, the giant scary risk management matrix that everyone loves to hate. When you read these news media articles on aircraft crashes, I guarantee you in every single one of them, you will find the obligatory statement, well, aircraft crashes are very rare and it's safer than driving, or something like that. That's the general sentiment that seems to be culturally, socially, politically, economically, whatever, required to even talk about an aviation mishap. It's safer than driving, right? That's what you get. This is because we, for whatever reason, feel obligated to point out that aviation mishaps are usually categorized right down here in the risk management matrix, right? They're very rare, right? They're very, very rare, but when they do happen, they tend to be either major or severe when we're talking about a catastrophic incident. Now, once again, there are a variety of aircraft aviation mishaps, and you can have an aircraft mishap where a tire blows out on landing or takeoff or something, and that gets classified as an incident, so the overall risk to you is pretty low, right? I'm not talking about those kinds of incidents. I'm talking about the kind that can have you crawling out through an emergency exit. This chart itself is probably quite inflammatory, but I personally would categorize aviation incidents, or the risk of a problem occurring, the risk of an emergency happening during a flight, is very rare, but if it's going to happen, the ones that I'm going to be concerned about and the ones that I want to prepare for are either going to be major or severe, right? But there is one thing we have to remember: risk mitigation. Generally speaking, we can mitigate risk down to an acceptable level based on preparations we can take, right? So in commercial aviation, what can passengers do to mitigate the risk, if there is any? What little risk there is, what can passengers do to mitigate it? Not much. You are cattle in a tube in the sky, right? There's not much you can do. You can be situationally aware. You can pay attention to things that are going on. You can carry survival and medical gear, whatever you can get past TSA. You can do that. But other than that, there's not a whole lot you can do. So what's the bottom line here? Why does this matter to talk about? Well, I wanted to address this because, again, the information space is very saturated on this, so a lot of questions are coming out. The first question is, are aviation mishaps being over-amplified in the media? Are the media sources amplifying this to make it seem like it's more of a dire threat than it is? Well, to answer that question, again, we have to go back to the definitions. If you're defining the mishaps that are occurring, if you're defining them in terms of numbers, then yeah, the mainstream media is going to over-amplify things, because in terms of pure data, pure numbers, the number of aviation crashes and incidents and accidents is much lower than it has been historically. However, if you're defining mishaps in terms of severity, the answer's not so clear, is it? Because we may have to figure out a way of quantifying subjective data. That's a very hard task to do, and the more subjective something is, the more variation that you have, and the wider your assessments start to become. So this factors into the next question, which is, are aviation mishaps increasing in severity, even though the overall number of incidents is going down? I don't know. Maybe. More data is definitely needed, but I suspect so. That's just my personal opinion. Again, I'm sure a lot of people in the aviation industry would disagree, but it seems like we're not measuring things as accurately as we need to be doing. So maybe we need to look at how the assessments are carried out. But in any case, I suppose this is probably all just a grand waste of time, because at the end of the day, is this still an exercise in personal risk assessment and personal risk mitigation? Yes. The answer to that is yes. You're still, the individual person who buys a plane ticket is still going to have to weigh the risks. So using what we've learned so far and what we've discussed so far, let's come back to Delta Flight 4819 and see, does any of this factor in? What are some of the initial lessons learned? What are some of the things that we could have done better if we were maybe a passenger on this aircraft? One of the main things that we can learn from this is that the survival doctrine remains relevant, okay? And what I mean by that is, please pay attention to the safety brief. These days, when everybody's flying, it seems like as soon as everybody gets into their seat, they put their seatbelt on, they pop their earbuds in, and they zone out for the rest of the flight. Statistically speaking, we have proven time and time again, especially based on the mishaps that have occurred this year alone. What is the most risky point of any flight? Shortly after takeoff and shortly before landing. That is the highest risk portion of your entire flight. That's why the seatbelt sign is on for a certain period of time. It's not the pilot arbitrarily saying you can now leave your seats. No, there's a doctrinal process behind this. Basically, it means that they've cleared a certain altitude threshold, and it's exceptionally statistically unlikely for a disaster to occur. It really is for your safety. It's not just to keep you in your seat and out of their hair. It's a real thing. So that is something to remember. Again, another thing that not a lot of people are going to want to hear is personal fitness is paramount. And I say that not just because it's important for everyone. I say that because it has become even more apparent as Americans in general, specifically Americans, tend to be a lot more unhealthy. You may be physically fit, you may be in the gym every day, you may be in good shape and improving constantly, but I guarantee you, most of the people around you are not. Just to be as indelicate as humanly possible, looking around on some planes these days, you really question, can this person, sitting 3 or 4 rows in front of me, between me and the exit, can they fit through that emergency exit? On some aircraft, it's no problem. On some aircraft, it might be. So once again, this is something that I don't think gets factored into a lot of NTSB data, if you know what I mean. Again, this is just some of my initial thoughts after this. I don't know how helpful this will be for a lot of you, but these are the things that I think about when we start hearing about these clusters of aviation incidents occurring more often. So we'll move on from there, and we'll talk about something else that occurred in Newfoundland yesterday, as a matter of fact. So moving up north just slightly to the area where I have not made a map for yet, our Canadian brethren to the north have had themselves a cable cutting incident. Technically, this is the second time that an undersea communications cable, a fiber optic cable, has been cut between Nova Scotia and Newfoundland and Labrador. So this cable ran from Dingwall to Codroy, and it was actually cut by what they think is an anchor dragging incident back in December. So I saw it then, and I didn't really pay attention because anchor dragging things happen all the time. Now, when it's in the Baltic Sea, it's a little different. We'll talk about that in a moment. But anchor dragging incidents happen quite often, so not that big of a deal. Well, this time, the repair company went out there and showed us a picture of the actual cable itself. And again, I'm no expert on this sort of thing, but it sure looks like that was cut with some sort of pneumatic snipping apparatus that we may have seen before. And it would seem that at least the crew of the vessel that went to go repair this cable thinks the same thing. So this photo really takes this case into the realm of interesting, and I guess we'll have to see what comes of it. I have not heard of any suspected Russian or suspected Chinese or even suspected American cable cutting operations taking place in Labrador. That's very strange. But this is very interesting and slightly concerning because, as many of you know, in this general region are the old school SOSUS arrays that have a very long and very interesting history with regards to detecting Russian submarines. So this is a geographic region of the world in which it doesn't really get a lot of press, doesn't get a lot of attention most of the time. However, during the height of the Cold War, this was a pretty happening place, and I think that this cable cutting incident may start to signal a little bit of that occurring in our more modern times, which is interesting. So again, it's very speculative. There's no real definitive proof of anything. However, we know that the number of nations that can do this is very limited, especially when it comes to making a clean cut like this. It's going to draw the list of suspects down to just a few people, just a few nations. So, of course, the U.S. Navy and the Canadians are not going to tell us if the sonar beds out there in the North Atlantic have been cut or tapped or anything like that. They're not going to tell us about that. That's never going to be made public. But very interesting that this is occurring in the same general region. So something to keep an eye on, I guess. Another thing to keep an eye on is the situation out in Ohio. And this is the ongoing crisis with regards to the terrain denial or force projection operations being conducted in Lincoln Heights. Yes, the situation in Lincoln Heights continues as before. As a matter of fact, it's gotten worse. So I did want to keep this fresh in everyone's mind because of the follow-on effects. So essentially, the short version is the police did not do anything at all with regards to these armed men in Lincoln Heights setting up checkpoints, demanding to know why people are in their neighborhood. Newsflash, it's not their neighborhood, but demanding to know why people are in the area, intimidating people with guns, saying you can't go through certain checkpoints unless you're approved, and all of this taking place on a major highway. Since the police did nothing, guess what? They've become emboldened, and they've pushed their perimeter out, as you would expect. So, the manager of the local Wendy's there at the off-ramp has stated that, and confirmed to journalists at least, that armed men were harassing people and continue to harass people in the drive-thru of that Wendy's, asking them why they're there and telling them to leave and things like that. The police response so far, all of the statements from the local police have been the classic, and I mean utterly classic, cases of essentially, well, we drove through the area and didn't see anything, or I'm not aware of any problems. That's the most commonly repeated phrase from law enforcement officials in the area. I'm not aware of any problems. Again, we know what this is. The local PD, the local sheriff's department doesn't want to police this. They really do not want to acknowledge what's going on. They don't want to do it, so they're just kind of ignoring the problem. But what I find to be very interesting is that a lot of very openly far left media groups have gone in there to try to get the story, and they have been harassed, intimidated, told they're going to be shot, things like that. So, you can see these quotes from the news media articles of journalists saying, far left journalists saying, we're being threatened with murder here. So this is also made worse by, from what I have seen, manipulation on specifically Twitter. So for many of you who are users of Twitter, who have used Twitter since Elon Musk took over, many of you know that they have this community notes feature that pops up under several posts where users can add context to posts. Well, from what I have seen, pretty much all of the posts that are calling this illegal behavior out for being illegal have very, very false community notes underneath them. So they will say that the efforts were justified because of the neo-Nazi protest or something like that, and at least one community note that I see here just has blatantly false information. So they say that the checkpoint doesn't exist. It was a police checkpoint. That's not true. There was a police checkpoint right when the initial incident took place, just police blocking the road to keep the protesters away from each other, but that only lasted for about 15 minutes. The checkpoints that people are concerned about are being run by people who are shoving guns in, people's faces and saying you can't drive on a public road. That's the checkpoint that people are concerned about, and these checkpoints keep popping up. So again, this is a very serious situation that I think is going to get out of hand very quickly because it keeps expanding. In a larger sense, for those of you who maybe don't recognize this type of behavior, this is how insurgent groups get started. This is how they are able to take advantage of what we call power vacuums. Right now, this is a power vacuum. Lincoln Heights is a power vacuum. No one in authority, with any government authority, wants to do anything about the situation. So guess what? Warlords pop up, and this is exactly what's happened, and it's spreading out of Lincoln Heights. So hopefully the situation will simmer down, but I'm concerned that this situation is not going to simmer down. I'm concerned that because this dynamic in power and control is not addressed, and the local PD and local sheriff's department basically just says, we don't get paid enough to deal with this. This is the kind of thing that's going to get out of hand very quickly, because this power vacuum, as long as that power vacuum is allowed to exist, these groups will grow stronger, and more importantly, it's probably going to happen somewhere else. Something to keep in mind if you're in the area, and especially if you're in Cincinnati. A lot of the local groups will look at what's happening up north in Lincoln Heights, and they may get some ideas. So I guess we'll have to wait and see how it turns out. Moving outside the United States for a bit, I briefly wanted to mention that as of this morning, I've seen a lot of reporting from a few European media groups that claim that the Sea Lion 1 cable between Finland and Germany was cut once again. As of me putting these slides together, this is a very developing thing. I saw the story last night, but there hasn't really been a whole lot of corroborating information on this, so I'll just briefly mention it, and we can wait to see if we get any more information on it next week. But right now, this is the third time that Sea Lion 1 cable has been cut. Cables being cut at the exact same time, almost at the exact same time, in the Baltic Sea and in Labrador. That's very interesting. So it would seem that while negotiations are ongoing with this Ukraine war thing, at least a lot of the speculation is that these types of Cold War era spy game kind of things are continuing to go on. So I don't know. Is this being done by Russia to pressure peace talks? Maybe. You'd expect them to do something like this in that case, but there's no way to know. Again, it's all just going to be very speculative because I can't swim down there and take a picture of the cable myself. We're having to rely on a lot of third-party information from agencies and groups that are not really known for telling the truth so much. So something that will definitely be a sticking point for NATO right now, because NATO has had an increased maritime security patrol pact, whatever they want to call it, in the Baltic Sea, that basically a few NATO member states have put their Navy ships on increased patrols in the Baltic, like that's going to do anything. I mean, the general sentiment is they can have a destroyer or something literally right up next to a Chinese ship and watch that Chinese ship drag anchor over top of a cable, and what are they going to do? Detain the ship and then let it go again? I mean, that's the kind of the European response to this at the moment, so we'll have to see how it all shakes out. But once again, submarine cables, very important part of global infrastructure when it comes to communications and things, and they keep being cut mysteriously for no reason whatsoever, apparently. So hopefully we'll have more data next week. So that's pretty much all I have for today. Let's roll into the intercepted GhostNet reports for this week. This week was pretty good. There were a lot of people sending messages back and forth, which was great. Saw a lot of testing, people trying to work email and WinLink and things like that. It was pretty neat. So I know that it's very limited in terms of capabilities, but it's still very good to see. And there were also a lot of news reports. For instance, in Spokane, Washington, there was a fairly large protest. I'd say it was 700 participants. The person says here, but nothing resulted from it. So fairly standard operation for this time of year, I suppose. Somebody also mentioned here there was a train derailment near Union, New Jersey. So yeah, that's something that I didn't write about this week in the Wire, but I should have mentioned that. And of course, somebody mentioning or transmitting the Wire. I only got pieces of it, so they must have been very far away from me, but that looks like somebody cut and pasted my Wire report for that day into GS8 and transmitted the whole thing. Takes a long time. Takes maybe 10-15 minutes to send over the radio a Wire report that is even just a short one, so sometimes they're fairly large. But yeah, the GhostNet's doing good. I am still working on the next iteration of it. It will not be ready for some period of time. I know this has been going on for a while, but upgrades are coming. There will be more things that will help out, I think, with regards to using HF radio a little bit more deliberately. So that's pretty much all I have for today. Thank you guys all for watching. Thank you for all of your support as well. It's been kind of a busy year already, and we're just approaching the end of February, so we can already see it's going to be a very busy time for the foreseeable future, but that's okay. I guess nobody will say that we live in boring times, that's for sure. So these are the sources for today. Again, you can get the links, which are clickable, either from the slides which I post on Patreon or from the Obsidian pages for all of these reports throughout the week. So once again, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your support, and we will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.